this sort of Renaissance model of the sculptor who works with the figure. All of it was very much based on sort of photography and the narrative, and it was really about creating these like halls of sculpture, and based on that very classical aesthetic. I really had no sort of technical aspect to my work because I didn't really see art and technology as two things that go together really well. I mean, especially not when it came to like painting or sculpture. That's not really encouraged in the arts. So, and that's just kind of the way it was when I started working here. So when I started working here, I started as a part-time professor, which I still am, and I'm also the sculpture technician, so I wear a lot of different hats, basically. And I slowly started moving towards more technical stuff, but that was after, you can see, this is another sculpture, so this is all my traditional stuff. I was still used to using technology. It was just an older type of technology, so like silicone casting. So this is from one of the studios I had in Toronto. It was a very classical sort of clay sculpture, and then you can see I'm making the mold of it, and this is the final piece. So I was making sculpture after sculpture after sculpture, and I started to kind of get disillusioned with sort of this old way of actually working, to the point where I kind of stopped doing it altogether. And then I started exploring technology because there is this sort of sense that if you have to sort of become technical, or else you're just not going to be sort of relevant. But I really didn't know how to do that, so I essentially just stopped making art for a few years until I met one of the professors who was teaching at the faculty at the time, and he was this sort of crazy professor who he worked with Arduino, and he made electronics, and he made all these weird devices, and I basically just started learning from him, and we started collaborating, and I decided I didn't want to make figurative work anymore, so what we decided to do was make this, I basically followed his lead. What we did was make this something that was basically around the idea of the Mars rover. So we got an old wheelchair, and then we hacked it, and we attached a remote control to it, and then we could basically drive it around the landscapes. And we would attach these sculptures on top of them, and the idea was they were this sort of aesthetic intervention on the landscape, much like the rover is this scientific intervention on the Mars surface. We had this like art rover, and we'd go to like Gatineau Park, and we'd drive it down freeways and highways, and everyone looked at us like we were crazy. But it really sort of opened up that potential for not only making art that was technical, because this is where I started to learn about like Arduino and all this sort of, and soldering and all this other electrical stuff and technical stuff, but it also made me start thinking about technology itself and how that could inform my work going forward. So this is, there's some of our videos, and like most conceptual art, it's kind of obscure and can be kind of boring. So I do have a website if you want to check it out. I won't bore you with the videos now, but this is the rover. We basically drove down this abandoned highway. Again, it's all this idea of like these sculptures that were interfering with the landscape. These are actually real. I'll just skip through these. And this is just another view of the rover kind of traveling in Gatineau Park. So once that was over, once that collaboration was finished, I started thinking more about, I didn't want to go back to the figures, so I started thinking more about how I could use technology in my own work. So one of the things I kind of landed on was this idea of artificial intelligence. And I started reading a lot about artificial intelligence and thinking about sort of this future that everyone talks about where AI was going to take over. So the next piece I made were these little art machines. And this is when I started creating these sort of machines of absurdity. And these little machines were essentially like an analog for sort of primitive life. Everyone often thinks of technology as this or artificial intelligence, these advanced machines that are going to start destroying everything and take over our jobs. So I started conceiving them as these like barnacles that would start growing and evolving. So I had these little clicker things that would click against these water towers, or these symbols of sort of like our post-industrial landscape. And they would be communicating with another machine that had these little flaps, and the flaps would lift up. So when the little clicking things would start communicating to the little flap machines, the flap machines would start moving up and doing their little display. So I basically had they were programmed with Arduino, and they had sensors that would detect the sound, and they would essentially be these two sort of primitive artificial intelligences kind of communicating to each other. So it was kind of like this idea, there was like the age of fish, and then there was the age of the reptiles, and then there was the age of the mammals. And it's like after we're gone, there's going to be the age of the machines. But it's not going to start with crazy AI, it'll start with these like weird barnacle things that start growing on the things that we leave behind. And so really, from there, I realized I didn't want to go back to the figurative work anymore, or the narrative, but I still wanted to explore ideas around technology and sort of problematize technology in new ways, and using art, and continue to use this aesthetic of the machine to talk about issues with technology. So the next piece I worked on, these are the actual, so I learned SolidWorks and parametric modeling to actually do it. This is how they actually worked. It was a little cam, so pretty simple stuff, but for someone who wasn't technical, it was a little bit of a learning curve to make. And these are these little motors that I had, and it would basically just spin the little motor. It was all just 3D printed, and it would cause it to click against the water tower. And here's the simpler other machine. So I'm trying to balance the concept with the technical side. It's usually, sometimes they don't mesh well together. So anyway, so I read this book called Superintelligence, which I loved. It really kind of changed my ideas about technology and sort of the future with artificial intelligence. And one of the things the author, Nick Bostrom, talks about is this idea of programming sort of philosophy. If you're creating artificial intelligence, you want to program sort of morality, and you want to program ethics initially into the artificial intelligent creature, because otherwise it will simply take whatever initial algorithm you give it and just take that to this sort of nth level, or this extreme. And he uses this example of a paperclip factory, where you're, say, some industrialist, and you want to make a lot of paper clips, and you want to do it really well, so you get an artificial intelligence and you say, make as many paper clips as possible. And then the intelligent machine decides that it's going to make as many paper clips as possible, so it's going to eventually destroy the factory. You can't turn it off because all of it is baked into its initial programming, and then it turns the entire world into sort of computranium to create more paper clips, and it's the end of the world. So that's obviously a really extreme example, but it really shows that the initial algorithm that you set on course with any sort of artificial intelligence is really, really important. So I started thinking about humans and our initial algorithms, which often aren't meshing too well with sort of the natural environment now, right? We have these algorithms that are to sort of create more and to simply find technological solutions or very instrumental ends. And it's really leading to this environmental degradation because we've been programmed with sort of an initial algorithm. So the piece that I came up with is this goose roller. I live by the river, and I spend a lot of time kind of walking by the river and observing the wildlife there. And I also have this deep love of birds that comes from when I was a kid. And I love that idea of flight and sort of the majesty of flight. So I thought of what happens if you sort of created this machine that would migrate this bird the same distance that it would migrate in the wild. And again, this was kind of, to use Nick Bostrom's term, a perverse instantiation of what we actually want. And this idea that this sort of purely instrumental thinking will actually create these like ghost worlds or sort of perversions of what we're actually trying to do. So this basically was just a CNC, more technology side, it was just CNC machine. It had that sort of aesthetic of that sort of 1930s mill, and it just basically rolls this goose over and over and over again until it reaches a certain length that it would travel in the wild. So this is just all the process shots of me creating it. This is the fabric. I CNC'd the gearbox. So again, it's this like 19th century sort of, you can see all the gears and all of the mechanics are very exposed. And this is the actual goose roller. So you can actually play the video. I won't play, this is the one video I'll kind of play to show you. So you can kind of skip to the middle of it. So you can see this thing just kind of keeps moving and keeps rolling. So taking something so beautiful element of flight and then turning it into this sort of perversion of what we actually meant to have. And yeah, so it's kind of keeps rolling. So. Yeah, it's a real like taxidermy piece. I worked briefly as a taxidermist. It's terrible, terrible work. But I did pick up the skill of taxidermy geese. But that's the other thing. When I was working as a taxidermist, it's like there's this idea that like they'd always say like business people want, you know, bears and they want lions and they want like roaring. And I would like sculpt the faces of the lions because you have to do, and they'd always be like, no, fiercer, more roaring. And it was always this like perversion, like the beautiful element of the animal is in the wild and in its natural habitat and sort of protected, isn't these like taxidermied animals. And spending so much time around them, it really made me understand how, you know, what we think is what we want to be surrounded by this wildlife is actually just sort of a perverse instantiation of our own instincts. So, anyway, so it keeps rolling for a while. And then it sort of just collapses. Anyway, so I'll keep going. Conceptual art has a lot of. Okay, so the next, so after I was done the goose roller, I started looking around at, again, working with environment and technology, and this idea that what really sort of protects us is not sort of the technological solutions, but the actual sort of political institutions and our sort of political structures and regulations that actually protect us. And I found all of these piles of wood from the dead ash barrow tree, and I thought that they looked very much like these monuments. And I had some experience making monumental work. And what it really was is this way of sort of forgetting. So people would build a monument and then they would forget about it. It's the same with the time capsule. People would put things into a time capsule in order to sort of preserve our culture or sort of project something into the future, but then it would just be lost to time. And they always think of these like objects, similar like the taxidermy animal, as what is actually important, and they're very much these sort of solutions that they fixate on, when it's actually the intangible elements that are the most important thing. And so that from this I made this piece that was presented in the pilot lab for one of the engineering art sort of collaborations. And it was basically it was called Seed Time Capsule Tomb, and it sort of juxtaposed those different ideas with each other, where what was really valuable in sort of projecting our culture is culture itself. So conferences, teaching our children, like promoting certain values. It's not these sort of dead forms of promoting our culture, like monuments or time capsules. So essentially I just took a bunch of logs by the river and put it into this giant sort of time capsule. So again, another sort of machine of absurdity. And this is all CNC, so you can see just CNC plexiglass. This is the original concept. This is the design that I did in SolidWorks, a little 3D printed model of it. And this is the log that I cast, so just a close-up of the log from the river. These are more of the logs that so the prototypes of the logs. I made these little live hinges and then screwed them all together to sort of make the plexiglass beginning. And this is my wife kind of doing some finishing touches and making sure it's all stable. And this is the final presentation of it in the pilot lab. The next piece that I was working on was continuing this idea of this fantasy that technology is just going to save us. Comes sort of from the idea of the prepper community, where I read an article where they were building this big sort of like underground condominium for very rich people in case the world comes to an end. And one of the rich patrons who bought one of these condos, it was in like an old missile silo, she wanted to project it onto the windows of her condominium views of Central Park. That were the same as the actual views of Central Park she had in her real condominium. So if the world ends, she could just sort of retreat to this mountainside redoubt and live out her life perfectly comfortably underground and look out at Central Park. And again, it's this idea that like salvation from sort of environmental degradation is this sort of vendable commodity where we're basically all individuals and we're all on our own, and the end of the world can be something, salvation from the end of the world can be something that you can just buy online, and then you can live it out and you don't actually have to contribute to the solutions that are sort of are being demanded of us, especially people who have the means to actually implement them. So this is, so I got this, this is from the Deacon bunker, so this sort of aesthetic I was picking up on. So the piece that I came up with was this emergency continuity of belief project, and what is essentially is a piece of emergency equipment that you would hook up to your sink, or your fresh water supply, and then you basically turn on your sink and it would start running this little looped animation. And I think this is actually a video. So this is all 3D printed, so again, very so it's basically running off of your water supply, and what it does is it gives you this animation, and the instructions are essentially to pick up the box that it came in, put it over your head, and then crawl down into a fetal position and just wait everything out. So it's not like an actual solution, it's just sort of a comment on this kind of culture and how much of a fantasy it actually is, and how what we really need is people to sort of activate and get into their communities and not just think of these technological fixes as sort of the end all and be all of the solution. So, okay. So this is again some of the models that I made. So you can see the little gear system. So you just hook it up to the sink, and it runs the little gear and it gears it down, and it plays the little animation. And this is the actual animation that's playing, so it's based on those posters that would actually show you what to do if the world's ending. This is your instructions. So, this piece, so now I'm getting a little bit more kind of funny. Like I just want to have like sort of more humor in my work. So I'm noticing that sort of garbage accumulates along the rivers, and sort of plastic accumulates in the water. I decided to sort of play with this idea of what we find valuable and what we find attractive by sort of spoofing the motif of the decoy. So instead of creating something like a duck decoy where you're trying to attract something, I created a decoy for attracting garbage. So you kind of float it in the water, and it would sort of attract garbage, and it really plays with this idea of what we actually find valuable and what we find sort of not valuable, and sort of that perversion of those two concepts. So this was CNC, so this was the first time I got into 3D scanning. So we at the department we're getting more into photogrammetry, so I 3D scanned in this garbage bag, and actually this is a video, so you can actually just play it. It just kind of rotates. Once I 3D scanned this video in, the garbage bag in, I sort of created the model, and then we cut it up into different parts, and then with the CNC machine I CNC'd it in foam, and then assembled it all together for the final piece. So this is just a digital rendering. And this is the final sort of piece sitting in the gallery. So, moving on from there, the next piece that I was working on was very much about looking at sort of old myths and allegories that we have about the environment. So one of the ways that people kind of explained migration, in the Middle Ages, is that they thought that the birds would just hide under the water with the fish, right? So there's very convenient ways of sort of living in a disappearing environment, right? And it's sort of a dying sort of environment. We can easily, the idea is how easily we can sort of construct narratives and allegories to sort of explain anything away. So this piece doesn't really fully resolve, but it does have an interesting little 3D printed component. It's basically this chicken that I made. So it's a chicken that I had cast in clay, but you can see it was cast from an original chicken with with feet, but then I 3D printed this parrot skull. And having that technology, it really kind of allowed me to work faster and sort of more accurately. And then from that, I created a clay model of the bird. And then from there, the final bird itself. So it's not completely done. I'm still kind of working through some of the ideas with it, but just goes to show how 3D printing can be used in sort of a lot of interesting ways that you might not initially see it being used. So I wouldn't have been able to make this piece without that initial skull as a reference model. Now I'm getting more into sort of animation and this idea of juxtaposing materials. So you can actually play this. It's a little video too. So this is an animation that I made in Blender, and this basically is playing around with different materials of like what's that false dichotomy of what's real and what's natural and what's not natural. And also the idea of a feedback loop. So I just have this little animated fan and this animated bubble wrap, and essentially this fan spins around and it angers the bubble wrap, and the bubble wrap starts popping. We don't actually have sound on this, so you can't really hear what's going on, but every revolution it keeps popping more and more, and eventually the bubble wrap starts sort of taking over the whole scene. So again, it's this idea of these environmental feedback loops that are sort of getting out of control. It's pretty subtle and like conceptually obscure, but I've been having fun with the program. So it just keeps going and going and going, and then if you have the sound, it just gets louder and louder and louder. But this is an interesting part of this is how I'm going to display it, so in just this little frame. But I actually scanned in the bubble wrap, or tried to scan in the bubble wrap and the barrel. So the workflow that we've sort of established is having this little Lazy Susan, and you put the object on the Lazy Susan, and you take like 300 photographs of it, and you capture it from every angle, and then using a program called Agisoft, you can actually put it into a 3D environment. This is the UV map of it, which is kind of crazy, but we can work around that. I also scan in bubble wrap, so it doesn't actually let you scan in things that are shiny or reflective, so I spray painted it. And this is what I originally got, so it didn't work out too well. This is the scanned in bubble wrap, and then the barrel worked out really, really well. But the bubble wrap didn't, so I actually just had to model and texture the bubble wrap in Blender to actually create the effect. This is another piece I'm working on, so this is going to be a VR piece, and you can actually play the video for this. And then what's going to happen is you're going to walk into the immersive environment, and as you get closer to it, the bubble wrap will start to sort of calm down, go back into its barrel, and sort of relax. But as you walk away from it, it will begin to sort of crackle and pop, sort of demand your attention, and then you'll kind of you come back to it, and then it starts to calm down and relax. So this idea of, this like sort of unnatural material that's very loud and obnoxious, sort of demanding that you constantly sort of take care of it, is kind of the idea where I'm going with it. And that's just an upcoming project. So 3D scanning and photogrammetry is something that we are really starting to push more in visual arts. And just here's another example. So this is one of the sculptures that I made at the beginning. And like from plaster, and so you can kind of see it rotating. And so this is an actual 3D scan of that plaster sculpture. So it's going too slow. And then this is a 3D print of it. So we're quickly being able to sort of convert older sort of sculptures and objects into sort of 3D environments where they can be used for animation, virtual reality, or 3D printing. We've also kind of pushed ahead with actually scanning and doing like figure scanning, so scanning in people. So this kind of brings me all the way back to the beginning now, where I'm back into sort of figurative work, not for myself, but actually just for the students, to actually bring themselves into 3D environments. So this is our woodshop technician, and he was really kind enough to be scanned in, and the program again is Agisoft. And down there you can see all of the little photos from all the angles that it takes to make. And then this is the model that it comes up with. And this is a program called Mesh Mixer, so it's basically digital clay. With this digital clay you can go in and do any sort of finishing touches. And then this is the final 3D print of Michelle, and then you can see the two of them together, so it's coming out pretty accurately. So I've been teaching a class on figurative sculpture for a while, so this whole last 5 years I think I've been doing it, and very much focusing on clay and a traditional workflow. So this last year I actually introduced this to a whole class of students, and they did a great job sort of first of all doing the traditional work, but then once they had done sort of the traditional modeling and casting, going into our makerspace that we have in art, and actually doing a 3D scanner themselves. So that juxtaposition of like the traditional and the non-traditional, or the digital, has been really interesting to watch. So just here's a few examples. So you can see. So yeah, if you guys are interested in learning how to scan yourself in and kind of following that workflow, come by the Visual Arts building, because we have all of the sort of setup there to do it, and we're starting to introduce them into sort of one-credit courses. So you can always look on the Visual Arts website and sign up for one of those. Just to sort of plug the Visual Arts website, this is our facility. So there's a CNC machine that I use to make all of the sort of CNC cuts that I did for the different projects I've been working on. And this is our sort of version of the makerspace, which is called Atelier Cofab. And you guys are always welcome to come over and print there. So the benefit, so there is a membership fee sort of, because we don't have as much sort of subsidies to pay for it, but you can print 24 hours a day for as long as you want. So if you want to do really big prints, then come to the Visual Arts Makerspace, and you can print as long as you want for just a small fee. And once you pay the membership fee, you have unlimited printing. So yeah, so this is the facilities that we have over there. And again, we like to always collaborate with engineers and sort of work with the idea of art and technology. And this is just in our little way, our little space that we're kind of breaking more into sort of the technological space. So, okay. Any questions? Yeah.
Like, I'm assuming you've been doing visual arts for a while. How did you get into making some big sculptures? Because if I want to make a piece, right, like I can't branch into such art.
You mean like the large machine kind of?
Yeah, that sort of thing. Like, where are you research? Like, what are you doing research?
I mean, well, working in the department is probably that's the hardest part of sculpture. That's one of the reasons why I've been sort of migrating more into virtual reality and sort of digital work. It's because it is really difficult and resource taxing to actually make these big sculptures. But you know, as a student, you always have people don't understand a lot of the facilities that we have over at Visual Arts. So we have like metal shop, wood shop, 3D scanning, 3D printing, and all of these capabilities. If you guys are sort of interested in making sort of big sculptures like that, then there's courses that you can take. And once you're enrolled as a student in visual arts, you have access to all of these things to make. So it's usually good to take advantage of these things while you're a student. And then once you're out of there, out of the university, then there are sort of labs that you can work in. There's workshops that you can work in around the city, or you can just sort of set up your own studio at home. But it is always a challenge to make sort of big sort of structures like that. And this taxing is not only in storage, but also materials and transportation and everything. So it's a question I still deal with how to make.
So for the Blender animation, did you have like a reference image for like I guess the paper, like the wallpaper and everything?
No, the wallpaper is just a wallpaper that I had just taken a photograph of and made into an asset, and then everything else, the fan I modeled myself, but it was really the barrel and the bubble wrap that I was interested in, because those were sort of scanned into these environments.